There's a bit of a strange pattern I've started to notice whenever I walk into someone's home. It's not everybody's home, just a very specific kind of person, as you'll see in a minute. It usually belongs to someone who says they don't really read fiction, and every single time, by some miracle, their bookshelves always look extremely identical. Atomic Habits, Rich Dad Poor Dad, The 48 Laws of Power. There's even a couple other books, but these are the core three. Now, whether you think these books are insightful or just aggressively beige is a conversation for another time, and not one I'm really interested in having today. I just find it impressive how often they appear in the exact same order. What does interest me is when this kind of bookshelf encounters this kind. A shelf full of fiction. Because that's when one specific comment makes an appearance. It's rarely said in a rude, cruel manner, but I think it is meant to be corrective. Like, fiction is some sort of phase that you're supposed to eventually outgrow, and according to a surprising number of people, stories are fine as long as they don't stop you from being an optimized adult human being. Underlying that one specific comment is a really dangerous assumption that reading has to be productive, useful, and ideally even capable of being summarized into bullet points. And fiction apparently fails that test 0 to 1. I think it's due time I admit to a couple of things. I am kind of biased in this topic. I read fiction. I love fiction. There's a full shelf of fiction behind me. There's a full shelf of fiction in front of me. But hey, bias does not invalidate an argument, especially when history, psychology, and some of the greatest names to put pen to paper seem to agree with the exact same sentiment as me. To be clear, before I give you the wrong impression, this video is not an attack on non-fiction. Some non-fiction books absolutely are helpful, but if you are putting down fiction as something inferior because it doesn't offer actionable, explicit advice, you are essentially misunderstanding how the human brain learns and comprehends different things. So the question isn't exactly if fiction is valuable, because I think we have strong enough grounds to establish that it clearly is. The question I often find myself facing is why it keeps being treated like it isn't. You've most likely come across this debate before because it's a topic that's been milked to the bone, okay? It's been milked dry, and I'm milking it even more. And one of the most common and probably even strongest arguments in favor of reading fiction is that it builds empathy. Now that brings me to my next question. How does a story that we all know is entirely fabricated, populated by characters that we know don't exist, meaningfully manage to shape our emotional intelligence by even a single ounce? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. I like to call it emotional catfishing.
The more you read, the more you understand things. So I've definitely had situations where I've read a book and understood a bit more about something, and perhaps understood a bit more about somebody.
This is Gregory. He's a great friend, a really talented voice actor, and also an avid reader of fiction. I really didn't want to do this alone, so I asked him if he'd be willing to come on and give his 2 cents on the topic, and he gladly agreed to be part of this.
Because all books are, written from different points of view, from different political opinions, from different emotions and different experiences, the more you read, the more rounded your view of things becomes, I think, of the world. I think people who read fiction tend to be less ignorant, in my experience, because they understand.
This is an amazing point, because this is where fiction does something really unique with its medium. Because at its most basic level, fiction lets you experience emotions without having to live through the situations that caused them. When you read fiction, you are essentially inhabiting the life of another person.
You get to be John Malkovich for 15 minutes.
You see what they notice, what they misunderstand, what they're afraid of, what they want. You essentially get full-on inner access to that person's brain. Now, that level of access, as we all know, is almost impossible in real life, unless you're some kind of telepath, but it's also kind of foundational to what makes fiction so powerful. And the more often you experience these different kinds of emotions, the harder it becomes to assume that everybody else thinks the same way as you do, which honestly is a really important realization to come to as a fully fledged human being.
I think a well-written character in a book has 2 levels. It has face level, is what we will see on a day-to-day basis, but then you get underneath the skin, you get into why they do what they do and what their experiences have been to lead up to this point, and it makes you then project that way of analysing things on two people in real life. So I think, yeah, it makes you more understanding and empathetic, I think.
I'm gonna use a really good example from a really popular book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. The entire series is mostly narrated through Harry's own limited perspective. And for this example, we're gonna be going back to the first few books of the series. Specifically the first book, because this is the book in which we get a real peek into Harry's childhood before all the crazy shenanigans happen. Because these books are narrated through Harry's own limited perspective, the neglect he experiences from his only living family doesn't exactly register as abuse to him. Because in his mind, it's just his ordinary life. There's nothing new to it. And as readers, it's like we're looking through a glass window because we immediately notice that this kind of neglect is wrong. Because having to live in a closet is not normal, and it shouldn't be. Unless you're a broom, which I doubt you are, because you wouldn't be watching this video then, would you? And I don't care how expensive rent in London is, it just isn't acceptable to live in a closet. Anyways, in the first few books, Harry essentially gets excluded from his own living family, and he's pretty much treated as an inconvenience the entire time, which is just depressing as you read about it.
We've raised you since you were a baby, given you the food off our table, even let you have Dudley's second bedroom, purely out of the goodness of our hearts.
I'll be in my bedroom, making no noise and pretending that I don't exist.
The gap between what Harry accepts as normal and what we see as wrong is where the effect comes into play. Now, what makes this moment so powerful is that as readers, we're not expected to intervene and fix the situation as we would if we were to encounter something similar in real life. Fiction is the only situation in which you're not required to call CPS when you read something like this. Instead, we're simply asked to witness, and when the chapter eventually comes to an end, we come out of it with an understanding of what neglect and isolation feels like from the inside, how these small, seemingly mundane cruelties can accumulate into something deeply damaging. By inhabiting Harry's experiences, we essentially get insight without responsibility. Now, that awareness does not simply go boom when the book closes either. Whether consciously or subconsciously, it begins to impact how you see the world around you. Knowing what exclusion and neglect feels like from the inside, it makes you more attuned to noticing similar patterns in real life. And just as importantly, it pushes you away from being the same kind of terrible people the Dursleys were. If you haven't read the books, the Dursleys are the worst of the worst to exist in this entire planet.
Who'd want to be friends with you?
Take it from me, you do not want to be compared to the Dursleys. Now, obviously, this awareness is not immediate or even straightforward, to say the least. Emotional intelligence does not exactly manifest overnight, neither can you summon it through sheer intention like a genie from a lamp. Instead, the effects of fiction gradually unfold over the course of months and sometimes even years. And more often than not, the changes are entirely subconscious because fiction shapes you into a better person in real time. It's almost like how you don't notice your own appearance changing and shifting over the past few years, but the moment you go back and take one look at an old photograph, you are surprised at how you used to look and how much you've changed. That's the kind of change that fiction offers, except in a more emotional sense. But that brought me to another inevitable question. Does every single book have to teach you something to be considered worthwhile? Because if that was the case, then pretty much half of the books that I've read so far would qualify as a complete waste of time.
I don't think so necessarily. I don't think it needs to have a message. It's all subjective, isn't it? It all depends on what you want to read and what you want to get out of something, that particular moment in your life. So no, I don't think so necessarily.
Not every book needs to end with a neatly packaged thesis statement at the end, because fiction is not a sermon, and it most definitely isn't a self-help book disguised as entertainment. Some stories simply exist to immerse you, to entertain you, and that's okay because there is nothing wrong or inherently shallow about it. Now, the problem only comes when the default expectation of fiction becomes comfort. A book doesn't need to teach you a lesson to be considered worthwhile, but it does need to do something, and undeniably, all forms of fiction are going to affect you in some way. It can sharpen your sense of humor, deepen your appreciation for the language, stretch your imagination, bring up interesting questions, and so much more. The list goes on. Fiction itself doesn't teach you any lessons or provide you with a solid, concrete solution to a problem, because literature is all about exploring these multifaceted perspectives that simply cannot be compressed into a black and white answer. It simply doesn't work that way because you cannot take a three-dimensional object and squeeze it into a one-dimensional object. And I think this literature professor on his TEDx lecture puts it perfectly.
Literature teaches you to ask the right questions. It won't provide all the answers. And books that do provide all the answers aren't being honest, because there's some things that there's no answer to. There's no rule book for getting over the death of a spouse or raising a child on your own.
This leads me to my next point about fiction: ambiguity. As Joseph Luzzi says in the lecture I just played for you, fiction rarely, if ever, is going to give you solid answers. What it gives you is more questions. And at face value, that might come across as a weakness. How could that possibly be more useful than a self-help book that clearly outlines all of its ideas step by step? But that's precisely the point, isn't it? I mean, we are complex human beings, not equations. Trying to place people in a scale of good and evil doesn't just feel wrong, it is wrong. With very few exceptions, no one is one or the other. We all carry our own contradictions. So when a book looks at a complex human situation and essentially tells hundreds of thousands of readers that, hey, this is exactly what you should do if you ever find yourself here, it assumes a universality that simply does not exist. Context matters in any scenario because everybody's living different lives. We all have different pressures, different expectations, different dreams. Any attempt at flattening that complexity into a prescribed solution is bound to fall short. And this is exactly where fiction gains its higher ground, because fiction, ironically, prepares you for real life by teaching you to live with uncertainty. Because I'm sure all of you know real life is rarely neat or final. There is no satisfying wrap-up where every single conflict is resolved in the span of 20 minutes and all of us end up in a group hug like the closing moments of a Modern Family episode. Life simply does not offer that kind of closure, and it's very important that all of us as human beings come to terms with it. You know, the more I dive deep into this topic, the more it just becomes increasingly clear why fiction is the more enduring medium of the bunch, and you will clearly understand why fiction is the more valuable form of literature when you take a look at what has truly stood the test of time. It's difficult and almost impossible to find a self-help book written in, let's just say, the 15th century, or even the 18th century. And that's not because the people back then lacked introspection or guidance. In fact, I think people back then were a lot smarter than the newer generation. I mean, take one look at TikTok and you'll understand. But it's because these kinds of books are inherently tied to the social norms and moral frameworks of their time. The advice they offer, no matter how insightful they were back in their time, faces the risk of becoming obsolete as cultures evolve over the course of time. And while these books certainly provide a lot of value and give a lot of helpful insights, the subject matter of these books frequently contorts itself to fit the prevailing ideals of the era they were written in. And as it turns out, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Blacksmiths just didn't stand the test of time. Fiction, on the other hand, and in sharp contrast, has demonstrated a remarkable ability to transcend time itself. Homer's The Iliad was composed nearly 2,700 years ago. Let that sink in. The book was written in the 8th century BCE, and it somehow remains as one of the most studied and referenced works of literature to ever exist in the modern world. Yeah, let that sink in. And this is just one example, because there are hundreds of books written hundreds of years ago that still resonate with a lot of people even today. Even novels produced within the last century, or what we would now call as classics, often somehow feels unsettlingly relevant to the modern day. For instance, books like 1984 by George Orwell, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and Fahrenheit 451, which were once regarded as speculative fiction or even fantasy fiction, now holds an uncanny resemblance to modern day issues with free speech and the erosion of individual thought.
So I write about something called the future, which is a wonderful thing to write about because nobody can fact check it. But I try to base my futures on realities that are with us today. So I'm not writing about Planet X. I'm not writing about a galaxy far, far away. I'm writing about this Earth in the near future, and everything that I put in has a basis in reality. Something we're doing now, something we've already done, something we're thinking of doing.
So throughout the entire video so far, we've discussed and clearly established that fiction does have some really great benefits to it. But at some point, we need to take a step back and study the bigger picture, because there is a much larger problem at play. And that is the decline of reading itself and why it's happening in the first place.
I think it's social media. I know that that's probably a cliche answer, but I think it is, because everything's so TikTok especially, and everything's reduced to a few seconds of, a burst of serotonin or whatever. Yeah, people's concentration span is just gone, I think. in general. I post videos on social media. I mean, they're not of any importance, but I do find that if my videos are longer than 30 seconds, a lot of the comments will be about the first 10 seconds of the video. When I go to the cinema or to the theatre, I find that lots of people are using their phones more and more now because they can't concentrate on, a 2-hour movie, which is such a shame.
The internet calls this the Great Attention Collapse, which I know sounds dramatic, but have you ever tried watching a 3-minute video without checking your phone once? You can be entirely honest because I am at fault for this too. Ever since the rise of modern technology, there has been no true dominant form of sustained entertainment. For a lot of the 20th century, cinema and movies came closest after its huge spike in the 1990s, but even back then, films and movies were constrained by accessibility because you couldn't exactly just turn on the TV and watch whatever movies you wanted to watch. They simply were not available on demand like streaming is today. So by the 1980s, books and fiction had occupied a sort of cultural space similar to social media, obviously not in the same scale because social media goes worldwide. Fast forward to the modern day, and even people who genuinely love literature find it difficult to find the time to sit down with a book for long, uninterrupted stretches.
Reading requires sitting alone by yourself in a quiet room, and I have friends, intelligent friends, who don't like to read because it's not just bored, there's an almost dread that comes up about having to be alone and having to be quiet, and you see that when you walk into most public spaces in America. It isn't quiet anymore. They pipe music through. It seems significant that we don't want things to be quiet ever anymore. There's this other part of you that's the same part that can kind of is almost hungry for silence and quiet and thinking really hard about the same thing for maybe half an hour instead of 30 seconds, that doesn't get fed at all.
And what makes this shift even more depressing is how it sharply contrasts the earlier periods of history. In the year 1858, thousands of Americans gathered around to listen to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were 7 public debates that went on for 3 hours each. And every single one of these debates were dense discussions into moral philosophy, slavery, constitutional law, you name it. And surprisingly, the audience was locked in throughout the entire thing, and they even engaged with these complex arguments that demanded sustained focus. And if you turn back the time even further to ancient Greece, the agora, which is essentially the ancient Greek markets, were once used as spaces to have these discussions on a daily basis. Infamous thinkers like Socrates would have these talks with the local people, tackling topics like knowledge, politics, ethics, and a lot more. And they did this with crowds who were willing to engage, listen, and even question these ideas. Attention in these contexts were not treated like some kind of scarce resource to treasure as we do today, but instead it was treated as more of a civic responsibility that was expected from your average Joe. Another point that I find really interesting is how reading fiction has never been more culturally mainstream before. I mean, just take one look around you and I'm sure you'll find fiction in every corner of the planet. Books are styled as accessories in fashion runways. Intelligence is being romanticized as this sort of aesthetic across social media. And being a reader has essentially become a full-fledged personality for a lot of people online, which isn't exactly a negative because being a reader is one of the best things that you could be. But we have gotten to a point where reading a simple book in public can earn you the label of being performative, which I don't understand because I promise you no one is pretending to read Dostoevsky for attention, okay? That's a pretty long con, and if you actually do that, then props to you, credit where credit's due. If I wanted attention, I would not choose a 700-page Russian novel as my strategy, because that's just intentional torture at this point. And yet, despite this apparent expansion of fiction into the more general populace, we somehow seem stuck in a persistent cultural stagnation. It's a strange irony because fiction is everywhere at this point, but its impact feels increasingly shallow. Now, coming back into the art of reading itself, the passion for reading is not something that you can wish into existence overnight, because that is a trait that is ultimately developed over the course of many years. And unsurprisingly, as many things do, it all stems from our childhood and how we approach reading back then. In fact, it is such a universal experience that I'm sure that all of you watching this video have experienced a similar phase before.
When I was a lot younger, 8-ish, that sort of age, I read a lot then for pleasure. And then when school started to get quite serious, I found that reading was just another chore to do, so I fell out of that. And then for a long, long time, I didn't read for because it felt like such a chore.
I think there is an undeniable pattern in how young adults encounter fiction that needs to be addressed. I'm talking about mandatory reading in high school. For so many young adults, this is the part of their lives in which they actually read a lot of books, and they don't do this out of personal passion, but they do it because English and literature classes require them to do so. And for a brief 2-year session, reading is no longer optional. It's not a passion or a hobby because it becomes an obligation that's been neatly integrated into our syllabi and assessments. And paradoxically, this period of time becomes the single most decisive test of a person's relationship with reading as they go into adulthood. The way these years unfold will determine whether the person goes on to read more books after graduation, or if they simply loathe it and toss all forms of literature away the moment they've got their graduation gowns on, which is unfortunately the more likelier option, as you all might have noticed.
I think that's why reading, especially reading things like fantasy when you are a child, is so magical, because those things, you don't know enough of the world yet to know that those things aren't possible.
This line from Greg reminded me of a certain quote attributed to one of the most infamous names in all of history. If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be even more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. Albert Einstein. Yeah, I'm talking about the guy with the crazy white hair who studied time, energy, space, and went on to develop the theory of relativity itself.
So when I was younger, I read a lot of Roald Dahl books. I think but because they're full of so many good morals and lessons, and I think it's in the twits. There are things like, there's a whole section where they talk about how when someone's ugly inside, it comes out of their face. No matter what they look like on their face looks ugly. And if they're a beautiful person inside, even if they're not as attractive as other people, they are attractive. That sort of thing has always stayed with me. And I've never really judged anybody by their looks. And I think it's because of things like that. It's messages that sort of fed into you to build you up to be a nicer person.
Although we have long since moved from childhood, the question still remains: why do people read fiction so infrequently? In a world that's always chasing entertainment, why is fiction not garnering a lot more attention?
I think perhaps some people who don't read at all would struggle with reading fiction, because I think with books, certainly there's a lot of reliance on imagination, and that you don't get with television or film, because you are shown everything and you almost don't have to think. But with reading, there is a lot of thinking. I think someone said once that reading is like staring at slices of tree and hallucinating for hours, which is exactly what it is, really, isn't it? But I think people who don't do that regularly or don't have an interest in it might find the concept odd.
This was something I didn't exactly think about until Greg brought it up. People tend to imagine things in very different ways. I'm pretty sure there's also this test that you can take to determine your imagination level, and that's because imagination itself seems less like a single uniform ability and more like a spectrum of its own. On one end of the spectrum are people who can open a book and imagine an entire movie unfolding in their heads with beautiful scenery, characters with sharp features, and a carefully constructed sense of mood and atmosphere all in their heads. For those readers, the act of reading is almost a cinematic thing, and it's no different to watching a film. On the other end are people who struggle to imagine anything at all. I do believe that this one factor also contributes deeply to the rise of television and film. With stories now readily available at our fingertips, the need to actively imagine has been largely abolished. We don't really have to construct these elaborate worlds in our minds because we are simply presented with these stories that have still a visual, sound, and so much more. The imagination bit has already been done for us, and that's one of the big parts of reading fiction. And I think we can all agree that watching television requires far less imaginative effort than reading a book. And while there's nothing wrong with watching films and television, I mean, I do it all the time myself, I do still feel like this passive overconsumption over the course of time can dull the very imagination that reading fiction once used to exercise.
At least the generation that I think of myself as part of was raised on television. And I think television, which is a commercial art that's a lot of fun, that requires very little of the recipient of the art, I think affects what people are looking for in various kinds of art. Fiction for me, mostly as a reader, is a very weird double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can be difficult and it can be redemptive and morally instructive and all the good stuff we learn in school. On the other hand, it's supposed to be fun. It is a lot of fun, and what what drew me into writing was mostly memories of really fun rainy afternoons spent with a book. I think part of the fun for me was being part of some kind of exchange between consciousnesses, a way for human beings to talk to each other about stuff that we normally can't talk about. Commercial entertainment, its efficiency, its sheer ability to deliver pleasure in large doses changes people's relationship to art and entertainment. It changes what an audience is looking for. I would argue it changes us in deeper ways than that. See, it would be one thing if everybody was absolutely delighted watching TV 24/7, but we have as a culture not only an enormous daily watching rate, but we have a tremendous cultural contempt for TV. There's this way in which we who are watching a whole lot are also aware that we're missing something, because television is really darn easy.
So yeah, this is a really multifaceted topic, and most of what I addressed in this video are surface level ideas. There is a lot more to this debate, but I'm afraid it would go on for 10 hours or so. But if you made it this far, congratulations, you've proven that you still have your attention span, which is great. Hold on to it, because you best believe you're gonna need it. Big thanks to Greg for agreeing to do this with me, and I'll see you on the next one, folks. Peace.